Good afternoon. I'm Hobson Willenthal, and it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to the University of Texas at Dallas and our annual Answerable Lecture. Those of you who have not visited us since the last lecture, of course, are seeing a lot of new things on campus. Our new venue in the School of Management, the Jindal School of Management, and your entry, hopefully, up our boulevard, our new landscaping. The new parts of campus you're seeing are merely the outer manifestation of continuing growth and change and improvement at the University of Texas at Dallas, most particularly since the essence of any university is its students. This year has seen a truly remarkable growth and improvement in our student body, and it can always be improved, but as I was telling Mr. Ackerman, a fall a year ago, we were very proud to enroll almost 1,400 freshmen with great academic records, and this fall we enrolled more than 1,800 with even better academic records, and that is phenomenal. It's also kind of terrifying to have that many new students in the freshman class. But everything on campus is booming, quality and quantity, physical facilities, and human capital. So it's really a great time for our university. And likewise, great times for the Holocaust Studies program and the Ackerman Center at the University of Texas at Dallas. And our longstanding, ever better Answerable Lecture. So welcome again. We have a great afternoon in store for all of us. And let me turn the microphone over to Sally Belofsky.
Thank you, Hobson. I want to, on behalf of the advisory board of the Holocaust Studies program, which I have the privilege of being chairman of, I want to welcome you to today's Answerable Lecture, and thank you for coming. Cowboys won today. It was a squeaker, but and so everybody is happy. We're very honored today to have Saul Friedlander with us, and he'll be introduced by Professor Ashfaq in a moment. But I want to mention to you that after the lecture, in the lobby out front, you'll be able to purchase, if you want to, some of his books. And the latest book is Nazi Germany and the Jews, which is a combination of his two books, Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Years of Persecution and the Years of Extermination. And I think Saul would be happy to sign it for you with maybe Orna will sign them too. Orna Kennan is Saul's wife, and she gets credit for doing all the editing and the combining of two major books into one 450-page book. So this is brand new, and so you can get a signed copy if you like. Also, I want to mention that tomorrow there's another lecture at 9 in the morning over at the Johnson building, and if you can go and want to go, out front you can pick up a parking permit and a map and directions on how to get there. The Monday morning lecture is usually less attended, but a lot more students there, but it's a wonderful opportunity to meet Saul Friedlander a little more intimately with less crowd around him. So pick one of these up before you leave. We're very, very honored today to have the president of the University of Texas at Dallas with us today, and the First Lady, David, Daniel, and Susan. I don't know where they're sitting. Oh, here they are. You want to stand up. David Daniel has been with the university about 6 years now. He's an engineer, and he came from University of Illinois, where he headed up the School of Engineering. And The changes on this campus and the improvements and the growth have been absolutely phenomenal. His goal is to build the best university, not necessarily the largest university, but the best university. And with Hobson's help and the help of his staff and all the great professors at this university, they're well on their way to becoming one of the very best in the world. And we, the citizens of Dallas, are all the beneficiaries of that. Like, look at this wonderful facility and this whole campus. It's all gonna benefit our community. I want to recognize two people who are here. One is Dr. Bert Einsbruck, who is the founder of the Einsbruck Lecture Series, and he's the immediate past president of the advisory board. Is Bert here? Here's Bert. Stand up, Bert. Hold on, please. Okay, thank you. And one other person I want to introduce just very briefly is Ed Ackerman. If the name sounds familiar, we're called the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, and everything good that's ever happened to this program in the last 10 years is largely a result of Ed's generosity and his support and his leadership. So let's say hello to Mr. Wonderful. Back on, of all dates, 9/11, we had an advisory board meeting, and Hobson Wildenthal is always there for our meetings, and he gives us inspiration and ideas for what we should be working on in the future. As little as 5 years ago, our major concern was our continuity. Could we exist? What would happen if the university decided that because of financial difficulty or something, they couldn't support us anymore? And there was a real genuine worry. And but that's 5 years ago. So Hobson reminded us, and he uses small words when he talks to us. He said, the Holocaust Studies program is real, and the University of Texas at Dallas is real. So don't worry about not continuing and not having a future and not being supported. And he said, just look at what we've got so far. You've got 4 full-time professors. 3 of them are endowed. You have a lecture series that's endowed. You have a fellowship that's endowed. You have a library that's endowed. So, and a general endowment that's growing very, very beautifully. So he said, but what we really need to think about is scholarships. We really need to be looking toward building scholarship funds because, as Hobson mentioned earlier, a great university is only as good as its students. And we compete with the whole world on attracting and holding and graduating the best possible students. So if we can offer students who are interested in Holocaust studies an incentive to come to this university by giving them a scholarship, that would be a point of difference between some other school that doesn't have a scholarship. So he said, and by the way, you could have an endowed scholarship for as little as $10,000 paid over 5 years, and you can name it, and it's there forever, in perpetuity, if I'm saying that right. But so that's something that the advisory board is going to pick up on, and we're going to package it and go out into the community and see people who might be interested in that. What I didn't mention, it's a naming opportunity, so that if you want to honor somebody by naming a scholarship after them forever, you could do it. Or if you want to do it in memory of somebody. So we're excited about that, and that's what we're going to be working on in 2012. Within a week or two, we're going to make a mailing on our annual Friends campaign, and that raises money for the daily operations, the Ackerman Center programs for the students, and outreach programs like this for the community. So when you get that mailing, please consider it, and a gift of any kind, of any size, is very greatly appreciated. So thank you for that. I think I've talked long enough. So I want to introduce now someone who doesn't need an introduction, Professor Zsuzsi Ashvat, who is the founder of the Holocaust Studies program. Probably 30 years ago, she is the heart and soul of the Holocaust Studies program. And she's also an author, prize-winning author, Holocaust survivor, lecturer, mother, grandmother. She's concert pianist. She's done it all. Zsuzsi, come on up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's terribly kind. Also, it's slightly difficult to come out after such introduction. So I would like to welcome you. I am incredibly happy that you are here and that we are having this wonderful afternoon. And I am so happy to introduce to you Professor Saul Friedlander, who is at the University of California in Los Angeles. He is a scholar, the like of which there are just very few in the world, among the great scholars of Holocaust studies. He really is one of the very few leading figures. He has written major books on the Holocaust and psychoanalysis. He has written a book on the figure who went to the Swedish embassy and who tried to call the attention of the Pope, Kurt Gerstein is his name in German, who has died then under terribly difficult circumstances. As a matter of fact, it was said that he died of suicide. But a major figure who has discovered in Belsen, he discovered the gas chambers and tried to notify the world. He also has written these books that Mr. Belowski has mentioned, really the major books that have been written on the Holocaust. He has put a dot after the discussion that went on for a decade regarding, or longer, regarding German involvement and German, so to speak, what was called guilt in the context, and German plans in the context of the Holocaust. It was a long, it's called the historical Streit in German, the historians' debate, which went on for a very long time, probably 20 years. I just would like to ask you to meet him and to listen to him and to learn from him. He's going to be a great experience for all of us.
Of course, I don't know how to. I think I need your help. As simple as that. Well, technology was never my forte. Professor Oshwart, thank you for this introduction. I could actually do without the lecture now, but Mr. President, Mr. Provost, Familie Anspruch, and Mr. and Mrs. Ackermann. I got it all. Thanks for being here, and I am bringing you a salute from California. I have no tie, as you notice. That's our specialty, that's our contribution to world culture. Let me try to explain in a nutshell what I'm going to then develop so that it should be clear to everybody. The history of the Holocaust over the years has been written in separate parts, in the plural. In Israel, and several other places, Warsaw, of course, after the war, and then in the States. And there was the Jewish history of the Holocaust. That is the, let's say, the fate of a ghetto, of a community, and so on. Then you had the history of each country telling about resistance collaboration with the Germans. And of course, in the middle of all that, you had the German history, that is the machinery of persecution and extermination. The prime book remains Raoul Hilberg's The Destruction of the European Jews. So in a way, you had several histories. And my aim in the work I will present to you is or was to bring all this together in one integrated history, which would show us the enormity, in a sense, beyond the German machinery, and also I wouldn't say the role, but the place of the victims in this history. So that is really the main idea, which I will try to develop tonight. And I will start with a photograph. David Murphy was awarded his doctorate in medicine at the University of Amsterdam on September 18th, 1942. On a photograph taken at the event, the faces of some of the people crowded in the rather exiguous hall, family members and friends, no doubt, are barely perceptible. The faculty members have donned their academic robes, while Murphy wears a tuxedo and a white tie. On the left side of his tuxedo jacket, Murphy displays a palm-sized Jewish star with the word Yod inscribed on it, Jew in Dutch. Murphy was the last Jewish student at the University of Amsterdam under German occupation. Shortly thereafter, he was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. He survived, as did 20% of the Jews of Holland. According to the same statistics, most of the Jews present at the ceremony did not. 80% did not. The picture raises some questions. How, for example, could the ceremony have taken place on September 18, 1942, although Jewish students were excluded from Dutch universities as of that date? The editors of Photography and the Holocaust, where the picture was reproduced, found the answer. The last day of the 1941-42 university year was Friday, 18 September 1942. The 1942-43 semester started on Monday, September 21. The 3 break allowed Murphy to receive his doctorate before the ban on Jewish students became mandatory. In other words, the university authorities agreed to use the administrative calendar against the intention of the German decree. This decision signaled an attitude widespread at Dutch universities since the fall of 1940. In parentheses, Dutch universities were very special in that case, and you won't find it anywhere else in Europe. The photograph documents an act of defiance on the rim of the occupiers' laws and decrees. Other issues arise. The deportations from Holland started on July 14, 1942. Almost daily, Germans and local police arrested Jews on the streets of Dutch cities to fill the weekly quotas. Murphy could not have attended this public academic ceremony without having received one of the special and temporary 17,000 exemption certificates that the Germans allowed the Jewish Council to distribute. This picture thus indirectly evokes the controversy surrounding the methods used by the head of the council to protect, for a while at least, some of the Jews of Amsterdam and abandon the great majority of Dutch and foreign Jews to their fate. The yod sewn on Murphy's coat, which meant that the new MD was to be murdered, does not appear in block letters or in any other commonly used script. The characters have been specially designed for this particular purpose and similarly drawn in the languages of the countries of deportation, Jude, Juif, Yod, etc., in a crooked, repulsive, and vaguely threatening way, intended to evoke the Hebrew alphabet and yet remain easily decipherable. And it is in this inscription and its peculiar design that the situation represented by the photograph reappears in its quintessence. The Germans were bent on exterminating the Jews as individuals and on erasing what the star and its inscription represented, the Jew, the concept, the Jew. Thus, from one single snapshot, the viewer gets the intimation of a vast number of interactions between German ideological hallucinations and administrative measures, Dutch institutions and individual choices, Jewish institutions, and at the center of it all, the fate of a Jewish individual. Translated into words, narrated within its context, interpreted at various levels of significance, the photo can be seen as an exemplary illustration of what could be defined as an integrated history of the Holocaust. In this presentation, I shall first address the very notion of an integrated history of the Holocaust, with particular emphasis on the history of the victims. Then turn to a few narrative and interpretive choices demanded by such an approach, and finally evoke some issues that were previously downplayed or ignored. First, the concept of an integrated history of the Holocaust. The need for an integrated history of the Holocaust first became clear to me during the debates of the mid and late 1980s, and particularly as a result of my confrontation with Martin Brochard, at the time the director of the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, regarding his 1985 plea for the historicization of National Socialism. In German, ein Plädoyer für die Historisierung des Nationalsozialismus. One of Brochard's arguments was directed against the traditional representation of the Third Reich as a simplistic black and white rendition that had to give way to various shades of gray. Brochard's barely hidden subtext, which emerged during our exchange of letters at the end of 1987, contended that the Jewish survivors' perception of this past, as well as that of their descendant, he specifically wrote, the Jewish participants and their descendants, as well, albeit worthy of respect, that he said worthy of respect, nonetheless represented, and I quote, a mythical memory that set, and I quote again, a coarsening obstacle on the path of a rational German historiography. What he was saying actually was that the burden carried by the victims and by Jews in general, that is the subjectivity of the victims here, did not allow them to write an objective history of the events. They had a mythical vision of it in black and white and so on. I had to answer, and I think I told that here many years ago when I came for the first time, that we carried a subjective burden. But having been in the Hitler Youth, as he had been, wasn't that also a subjective burden for writing history? So it created some tension then in our exchange. And I didn't know, of course, that he had been a member of the party, which became known only after his death. This view, I mean Brochard's view, perpetuated the intellectual segregation of the history of the Jews during the Nazi epoch and left it at best to Jewish historians. My own work, Nazi Germany and the Jews, was meant to show that no distinction was warranted between historians of various backgrounds in their professional approach to this subject, that all historians dealing with this theme had to be aware necessarily of their unavoidably subjective approach, and that all could muster enough self-critical insight to restrain this subjectivity. What mattered most to me in my own project was the inclusion of the Jewish dimension along all others within an integrated historical narrative. There is more, however, to this concept of integrated history. First, the history of these events cannot be limited to German decisions and measures only. It has to include the initiatives and reactions of authorities, institutions, and of the most diverse social groups throughout the occupied and satellite countries of German-controlled Europe, and actually much beyond. I speak also of American Jewry to a point, and of the neutral countries and so on. Second, at each stage, Jewish perceptions and reactions, collective or individual, cannot and should not be considered as a separate domain within any general historical rendition, as they impacted in various degrees upon all other elements of this history. They impacted on it. Finally, and I will explain how, finally, a simultaneous representation of the events, that is Jewish, French, let's say German, at all levels and in all different places, enhances the perception of the magnitude, the complexity, and the interrelatedness of the multiple components of this history. Let me very briefly address each of these points. We do not need to belabor the fact that the history of the extermination of the Jews of Europe cannot stop at the borders of the Reich, nor be limited to German decisions and measures only. One aspect of the German and European scene, marginalized at times, demands, however, to be stressed. And that was not known so well, let's say 15 years ago. The awareness among European elites and populations of what these anti-Jewish measures and policies meant. That is, one didn't know the widespread knowledge of what was happening. Nowadays, we know that a considerable amount of information about the extermination was available throughout Europe, and this from a rather early stage on. The Polish underground was openly referring to the mass murder as soon as it started. The Swiss federal authorities, including the police, explicitly evoked the consequences of the hermetic closing of borders for Jews in midsummer 1942. In Germany itself, the fate of the Jews was quite openly alluded to at various levels of the population. And I quote now, "In Bereza Kartushka, where I stopped for lunch, Wehrmacht Private HK wrote home on June 18, 1942, 1,300 Jews have just been shot on the previous day. Men, women, children had to undress completely and were then liquidated with a shot in the back of their neck. The clothes were disinfected and used again. I am convinced," he writes to his family, "that if the war goes on much longer, the Jews will be turned into sausage and served to Russian war prisoners and to Jewish specialized workers." So it was fun in a way. A few months later, Private SM, the Germans never published the names because of privacy laws and so on. Private SM, on his way to the front, wrote from the town of Auschwitz, and I quote him, "The Jews arrive here, that is to Auschwitz, at a weekly rate of 7,000 to 8,000. Shortly thereafter, the dire hero's death, ein Heldentod in German." And he added, "It's really good to see the world." In Minden, Westphalia, the west of Germany, the inhabitants had been discussing the fate of deportees from their own town as early as December 1941, and publicly mentioned that Jews who were unable to work were shot in the east. A few weeks later, in February 1942, Bishop Berning of Osnabrück noted that admittedly there was a plan to exterminate all the Jews. This is 2 weeks after the Wannsee Conference, where the extermination procedure in a way was discussed. So already Bishop Berning had heard it from somewhere, and Bishop Berning knew it would be spreading. Whereas here and there, small groups or individuals risked their lives in trying to help the hounded victims, no social segment or institution, the churches, peasantry, the business world, etc., intervened in most of occupied Europe, with some notable but small-scale national exceptions. Let's turn to the Jewish dimension of this history. Even when referred to within the essentially non-Jewish centered historiography, it tends to deal mainly with institutional collective Jewish behavior, with the decisions of Jewish leadership groups, or some of the best known attempts at resistance, the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, for example. But in fact, the main contribution to our knowledge at a collective level, bolstered by any number of individual testimonies, applies to a much wider and fundamental point which had not been seen really. In contradistinction to vast segments of the surrounding society, the victims did not know what was ultimately in store for them. In Germany and in the West, the information available to the Jews had somehow not been pieced together. In the East, the Jewish populations, in their immense majority, refused to believe what they saw. This, in turn, decisively contributed to the smoothness of the extermination process and to the so-called passivity of the victims. Expecting terrible hardship and even widespread death is one thing. Expecting immediate murder, quite another. I want to add here an example which I didn't introduce in my book because the diary of that person was published after I had published The Years of Extermination. It's the diary of a young French woman called Hélène Baer, of a very wealthy, upscale Parisian family. She was 19 or 20, studying for a doctorate in English literature at Sorbonne and expelled, of course, in 1942. She remained in Paris until 1944, until the summer of 1944, working at the Hôpital Rothschild Hospital in Paris, the only Jewish hospital. Only Jews were there. And she writes in her diary, sometime in the summer of 1944, well, everybody should have known, but not the Jews somehow. They, like terminal patients, simply did not want to know. She writes, yesterday they came and they took 24 patients, a woman about to give birth, a paralyzed man who simply was totally paralytic, a woman with half her face, tongue paralyzed, and so on. And then she adds, these people sent to work? That doesn't make any sense. They will die on the way. That is, here is that young woman, absolutely, she should hear, she could hear, whatever. And they take her patients, I mean, some patients of the hospital, and says, I mean, these people cannot work, they are paralyzed. What will they do? They will die on the way to wherever they are sending them to work camps. So there is no logic, of course, in this lack of will to understand, but there is an explanation, unfortunately. The history of the destruction of European Jewry at the level of individuals can be reconstructed from the perspective of the victims on the basis of post-war depositions, interviews, and memoirs, but mainly owing to the unusually large number of diaries and letters written during the events and recovered over the following decades. These diaries and letters were written by Jews of all countries, all walks of life, all age groups, either living under direct German domination or within the wider sphere of persecution. Of course, the diaries have to be used with the same critical attention as any other document. Yet, as a source for the history of Jewish life during the years of persecution and extermination, they remain crucial and irreplaceable. Thousands of witnesses confided their observations to the secrecy of their private writings. Major events and much of daily incidents, attitudes, and reactions to the surrounding world, which these chroniclers recorded, merged into an increasingly comprehensive, albeit at times contradictory picture. The contradictions show the authenticity, of course. Diaries and letters describe in great detail the initiatives and daily brutality of the perpetrators, the reactions of populations, the life and destruction of the chroniclers' communities, but they also record their own everyday world, that of despair, rumors, illusions, and hope in constant succession, mostly to the end. My dear little daddy, bad news. After my aunt, it's my turn to leave. Thus began the hastily pencil-written card sent on February 12, 1943, from Drancy, a camp near Paris, by 17-year-old Louise Jacobson to her father, who was still in Paris. He had been arrested, released. He lived for a little while more. And she writes, "I am in excellent spirits," she went on, "as everybody else. You should not worry, Daddy. First, I'm leaving in very good shape. This last week, I have eaten very, very well. I got 2 packages by proxy, one from a friend who was just deported." She didn't understand the tragic aspect of saying I ate all the food from the package sent to a friend who had been deported because she didn't know where. The other from my aunt, who was also deported. "Now your package arrived exactly at the right moment. We leave tomorrow morning. I'm with my friends, as many are leaving. I entrusted my watch and all my other belongings to decent people from my room. My daddy, I kiss you 100,000 times with all my strength. Courage et à bientôt, your daughter, Louise." On February 13, 1943, Louise left for Auschwitz in transport number 48 with 1,000 other French Jews. A surviving female friend, a chemical engineer, went through the selection with her. "Tell them that you are a chemist," Irma had whispered. When her turn arrived and she was asked about her profession, Louise declared student. She was sent to the left, to the gas chamber. Such personal chronicles, such individual Jewish voices, are also the most immediate testimonies about dimensions of ongoing events usually unperceived in other sources. Like flashes, they illuminate parts of a landscape, they confirm intuitions, they warn us against easy generalizations, they tear through the smugness of scholarly detachment. Mostly, they just repeat the known, but express it with unmatched forcefulness. Thus, reminiscing about the murder of some 12,000 Jews in Stanislavov on October 12, 1941, a young female diarist, Elsa Binder, brought up the fate of her 2 friends, Tamarchik and Esterke. "I hope," Elsa wrote, "that death was kind to Tamarchik and took her right away, and that she didn't have to suffer like her companion, Esterke, who was seen being strangled." And of course, Elsa herself was then deported, and one found her diary on the side of the road to the cemetery in Stanislavov, where the exterminations took place in 1941, in Galicia. Finally, simultaneous representation adds an essential dimension to the historical perception of the Holocaust. Simultaneous, that is Jewish, German, French, and so on. Of course, with Jewish at the center. It need not be solely transnational. It can apply to several categories of events, usually not linked to one another, occurring at the same time in the same country. Thus, in late December 1941, the decision to exterminate all the Jews of Europe had been taken. Hitler decided more or less at the end of 1941. At the same time, the main representative institution of the German Evangelical Church, the Church Chancellery, responding to a violently anti-Semitic stance taken by a number of local churches adhering to the German Christian line, which was a Nazi kind of Christianity, issued a statement of its own denying, now listen carefully, denying any solidarity with converted Jews, with the Jews in general, of course not, but with converted Jews, that is with the brethren and the sisters, the Christians, like the Evangelical Church Chancellery. This was made brutally clear in his circular letter published on December 23rd by the Chancellery's Deputy Director, Günther Fürle. And I quote him, "The breakthrough of racial consciousness in our people, intensified by the experience of the war and the corresponding measures taken by the political leadership, has brought about the elimination of the Jews from the community of us Germans. This is an incontestable fact, which the German evangelical churches, which serve the one eternal gospel within the German people and live within the legal domain of these people as corporation under public law, cannot heedlessly ignore. Therefore, in agreement with the spiritual council of the German Evangelical Church, we request the highest authorities to take suitable measures so that baptized non-Aryans remain separate from the ecclesiastical life of the German congregations. The baptized non-Aryans will have to find the ways and means to create their own facilities to serve the particular worship and pastoral needs." Nobody, and they add that they will do their best to help. Nobody was fooled by the last sentence of the Chancellery's statement. The confessing church protested, but its protest was that of a minority and did not call for any countermeasures. A few weeks earlier, several Catholic bishops, led by Bishop Preising of Berlin, circulated a text meant to express support for converted German Jews sent to the East. The majority of the bishops' conference, led by Cardinal Bertram of Breslau, rejected any such motion, even in its most timid phrasing. Of course, neither Protestants nor Catholics addressed the fate of the non-converted Jews. I mean, here we are all the time speaking of the converted to Catholicism or Protestantism. In other words, as the deportations from Germany started in the fall of 1941, and mainly as the first extermination sites were activated or built, Hitler and his acolytes could rely on the passivity of the only counterforce that had once challenged the regime about its criminal policies in the matter of killing of the mentally ill. There, the Bishop of Münster had protested in the cathedral, openly threatening to sue the party if they continued killing mentally ill, and Hitler thought what to do about the bishop, and then decided now, during the Russian campaign, we'll not start having problems with the Catholics in the country, so let's leave the bishop alone. And we will deal with him after the war. Well, it didn't stop the euthanasia, but it compelled Himmler to take a very roundabout way to continue killing the mentally ill. But nothing like that, of course, was heard about the Jews, and the bishop, whose name is Gallen, suddenly had slipped my mind, was asked by an anonymous Jew, of course anonymous, wrote to him, "Revered Bishop, I am a German Jew and I admire your heroic stand about the mentally ill. Could you say a few words about us Jews?" Of course, not a word. The simultaneity of the decision to murder all the Jews of Europe and the declared non-intervention of the Christian churches regarding converted Jews sets the early phase of the final solution in its wider German context. Usually one writes the history of the churches, the history of the extermination decisions, but one doesn't put it together. You see, that was my whole intention, to bring those things together. The same context takes on an additional tragically ironic meaning, and listen to that, as at the very same time, in the last days of 1941, in the Reich and all over occupied Europe, Jews were celebrating their oncoming liberation in view of the Soviet successes in front of Moscow. There was a brief Soviet counterattack in December 41. All over the diaries, you see that in Paris and in Vilna and in Berlin, of course, everybody was raising a glass to our liberation. The Soviets were coming. Well, it was just the beginning of the final solution. Two shorter, narration and interpretation. It may be unusual to devote any space to problems of narration in discussing a project in history in which, by definition, all the attention should be focused on conceptualization and interpretation. In fact, problems of narration almost defeated my own project and are liable to remain a major obstacle for similar future endeavors. We are dealing with events occurring in Germany, in every single country of occupied and satellite Europe, and well beyond. We are dealing with institutions and individual voices, with ideologies, religious traditions, etc. No general history of the Holocaust can do justice to the interaction of this diversity of elements by presenting them as independently juxtaposed, as was the case until recently. That is, history of the Jews, history of the resistance, history of the German machinery, and so on. Moreover, in following the fate of individual Jews, mainly of diarists, from the beginning of the war to their end in most cases, a chronological unfolding of the entire process becomes unavoidable. And now I will just explain in a few words what would be maybe too long to read. When I did the first volume, that is the years of persecution, it was rather simple because there was a unity of place. That is, all the events in their variety took place in Germany. The moment the war started and we entered the years of extermination, how can one bring together things happening in Lithuania and in France and on the Eastern Front and so on, and Norway and the Mediterranean and so on, plus the reactions of American Jewry or of the neutral countries. How can one do that? And it almost put an end to my project until I saw more or less the solution. In the first volume, The Years of Persecution, you had the unity of place, Germany. In the second volume, I took very small slices of time, let's say from September 39 to May 1940. And that allowed the reader, or allows the reader, to see those interactions because he or she focuses on a very short period, and so it went to the very end. I don't know if it always worked, but that was the intention. And it means that the integration here is based actually on the way of telling the story and not on an overall concept encompassing the events. Because in my opinion, and that would demand, tomorrow morning I will explain that to a smaller group and more maybe specialized group. There is no way of finding one concept encompassing the Holocaust, in my opinion, because of the multiplicity of factors precisely over the years. And therefore you have to use very limited concepts and try to explain this sequence and this sequence and that sequence. And so narration becomes crucial instead of conceptualization, but that, of course, can be discussed. Now, and here I will read again, as a leitmotif, if you wish, as a kind of ongoing thread in this history, I chose ideology. For me, ideology is the centerpiece holding all of this together. That is Nazi ideology. And I try to show it with a very simple argument. At the very end, and Professor Oshwat knows about what I'm talking, the very end, as she lived through it. 3 days before the liberation of Paris, trains were still leaving Drancy next to Paris with Jewish children to Auschwitz to be exterminated on the spot. In July 44, when the Russians were in Warsaw, on the outskirts of Warsaw, which is a story by itself, a boat was sent from Athens to the island of Rhodos in the Mediterranean to collect all the whole Jewish community of Rhodos, Sephardi Jews, by the way, fishermen mostly. Then slowly, over 10 days, it brought them to Athens back, and those who survived were put on the train, sent to Auschwitz, and killed immediately. That is, until the Reich was in rubble, was falling to pieces, yet the drive, and what best example would there be than the extermination of Hungarian Jewry? As the Reich, as the Allies were already, as D-Day was coming, and the extermination of Hungarian Jewry was not only taking place, but at a pace which had never been seen before. As quickly as was humanly possible, if one can use that term, the Nazis were killing and burning the bodies to such a point that the crematoria in Auschwitz couldn't function anymore, and they had to dig in the ground in Auschwitz and burn the corpses in pits because it was too fast and there were too many. And that was when already the Allies had landed in Normandy. So that, you see, if there had not been an ideology behind it, driving it to the very end, it would have slowly stopped. Because, you know, under those conditions of daily bombings and invasion from all sides, Italy, Normandy, and so on, the Germans had other things to do. The fact that this was pushed ahead means that the belief that this was absolutely necessary was a crucial kind of element. Now, let me come to the last point, which is a difficult one. Not difficult conceptually, but difficult for me to say. And I call it, in conclusion, questions answerable and unanswerable. And I warn you, I once spoke of this in Jerusalem at Yad Vashem, and some people got very upset, rightly so. But my job as a historian is simply to say what. An integrated history leads in and of itself to comparative queries, that is, you compare, and more generally to connections that are otherwise but dimly perceived. Let me present one telling example: the glaring lack of an overall Jewish solidarity in the face of the catastrophe. The German Jewish leadership attempted to bar endangered Polish Jews from emigrating from the Reich to Palestine in late 1939 and early 1940, in order to keep all emigration openings for German Jews only. Native French Jewish leadership, the consistoire, ceaselessly demanded from the Vichy government a clear-cut distinction between the status and treatment of native Jews, Israeli Français, and that of foreign ones. The councils in Poland, particularly in Warsaw, were allowing a whole array of privileges to members of the local middle class who could afford paying bribes, while the poor, the refugees from the provinces, and the mass of those devoid of any influence were increasingly pushed into slave labor or driven to starvation and death. Once the deportation started, the Polish Jews in Lodz, for example, turned against the deportees from the West. That is, the Jews of Germany were sent to Lodz, to Riga, to Minsk, and there the local Jews couldn't push back, but certainly to keep them as far as possible. In Westerbork, German Jews, the elite of the camp, Westerbork, Holland, closely working with the German commandants, protected their own and put Dutch Jews on the departure lists, while previously the Dutch Jewish elite had felt secure and was convinced that only refugees, mainly German Jews, were sent to the local camps and then deported. The hatred of Christian Jews by their Jewish brethren and vice versa, particularly in the Warsaw Ghetto, is notorious. Now, this is very painful. The other side of it is a little bit uplifting. Yet a strengthening of bonds appeared within small groups sharing a specific political or religious background, that is Orthodox Jews, or politically left-wing Jews, Zionists, among themselves. Groups sharing a specific political and religious. Such was typically the case of political youth groups in the ghettos, among Jewish scouts in France, and of course among this or that group of Orthodox Jews. In looking at the big picture, we may reach the conclusion that in a majority of cases, specific ethnic, cultural, political, or religious bonds shared by any number of subgroups took precedence over any feeling of shared Jewishness. Now the end. On June 27, 1945, the world-renowned Jewish Austrian chemist Lise Meitner, who in 1939 had emigrated from Germany to Sweden, wrote to her former colleague and friend Otto Hahn, who had continued to work in the Reich. After mentioning that he and the scientific community in Germany knew much about the worsening persecution of the Jews, Meitner went on. All of you have worked for Nazi Germany and never tried even passive resistance. Certainly to assuage your conscience, here and there you helped some person in need of assistance, but you allowed the murder of millions of innocent people and no protest was ever heard. Meitner's cri de coeur, addressed through Hahn to Germany's most prominent scientists, none of them active party members, none of them involved in criminal activities, could have applied as well to the entire intellectual and spiritual elite of the Reich, with some exceptions, of course, and to wide segments of the elites in occupied or satellite Europe. And an even more unsettling aspect of the same question arises in regard to the attitude of the Christian churches. In Germany, again with the exception of a few individuals, none of whom belonged to the higher reaches of the evangelical or Catholic Church, no Protestant bishop or Catholic prelate protested publicly against the extermination of the Jews. Of course, fear is an element which everybody understands, but no one did. When men of goodwill, such as Bishop Preising of Berlin, or the voice of the confessing church, the Württemberg Bishop Theophil Wurm, were ordered to stop their attempts at confidential protests, they were trying to reach Hitler, but confidentially, and they were told, you stop this. They submitted, that is, they didn't choose martyrdom, none of them. That an important number of personalities belonging to Germany's intellectual and spiritual elites did not take public stand against the murder of the Jews is easily understandable. But not even a few prominent voices were publicly heard is puzzling. That not a single personality of major stature was ready to speak out remains, as some other aspects of this history, a continuous source of disbelief. Thank you very much.
Professor Friedlander would be happy to answer your questions. Would you go ahead?
Professor Friedlander, on the question of ideology as the centerpiece, two facts stand out for me. I ask that you comment on them. One is the question of the Nazi Allied states, Romania, Hungary, and the gradual flagging of enthusiasm of the political class, especially in light of Stalingrad. And secondly, the question about the popularity of National Socialism or racial ideology in the universities from East to West Europe. That there you found gangs, people who were blurred the boundary between violence and intellectual enthusiasm, and where racial ideology promulgated successfully all across Europe.
Well, I will answer only very, very shortly to a huge question. But Nazi ideology and its racial dimensions spread like wildfire over not only occupied Europe, but actually in the 30s in countries like France, not a little bit in Italy, less in Italy than elsewhere. Hungary, of course, we had the Hungarian anti-Jewish laws, one starting in 22, I think 23, and then in the late 30s, Romania, they in a way linked up with local anti-Semitism. And I mean, it became a kind of bonfire because the local anti-Semitism was very strong in Poland. I mean, the case of Poland is terrible because the Germans really hit the Poles worse than probably any other group except the populations of the Western Soviet Union. I mean, Slavs, slaves, and to be murdered if need be. But what is so strange in Poland and in the Ukraine and so on, that very religious people hating the Germans nonetheless hated the Jews practically even more, saying the Germans, I mean, this was said by a group of Polish resistors, and it's well known, are solving quite a big problem in our country by eliminating the Jews. So the German ideology was welcome all over Europe. You even had Father Coughlin here and others a little bit playing into the same game. Now, there was a change of mind in Romania, for example, in 43. Why? Because the Allies, the Romanian army on the Stalingrad front had been practically eliminated totally. And the Allies it was clear the Allies were winning the war. There are exceptions to all that, a little bit in Denmark and a little bit in Italy. That is one of those remarkable aspects that the Italians, although fascists and so on, were, when it came to the German persecutions, they considered it as barbaric and tried to protect Jews against the German or the French police working for the Germans. Romania is simply the war was turning the Romanian government. Antonescu was trying now to find a solution with the Allies. Hungary is a tragic case. Again, Professor Oshvat knows it infinitely better than I do, and she wrote very beautifully about it. The Hungarian, the region probably wanted to avoid going to the extremes of deportation and extermination. Some people around also wanted to get away from the Germans. But the police level and the undersecretaries in the Ministry of the Interior were pushing it, and the Hungarian gendarmerie was really behind the concentration and the deportation. The Jews who really were saved, partly, were the Jews of Budapest, but that's a totally different story.
Good. Yes, Stan. In your views, was he a hero or did he betray his own initial intentions when he joined the Gestapo?
Yeah. Kurt Gerstein and Professor Schwab mentioned my biography of this strange person, a book written in '67, so it doesn't make me younger. Kurt Gerstein was a believing member of the Protestant Church in Germany. He, for reasons of his own, was on the one hand making religious propaganda against the Nazis in the 30s, was imprisoned twice, and then he volunteered for the Waffen-SS. And as he had a medical and engineering training, partly, he was sent to the disinfection unit of the Waffen-SS, which used cyclone to disinfect barracks and all kinds of large empty spaces. Now, it so happened that the same Gerstein was sent by his commander, Mrogowski, to Prague to take a huge shipment of cyclone and to bring it to Belzec, an extermination camp in the summer of '42. And Gerstein, not knowing where he was going, brought it, and then he was taken by the commander of Belzec to see an extermination of Dutch Jews. And he wrote a report where he says the diesel, because it was a diesel system there, the machine was linked to the gas chamber. It was not a cyclone, but the old method of killing. Belzec, Treblinka, Sobibor all used this method, the big diesel engine, and the fumes would kill the people in the gas chamber. And he noted when it started to work, and then it stopped, the engine stopped. And the Jews, he says, were weeping, crying, and the professor from Tübingen, standing with him, said, "Oh, like in a synagogue." And Tannenstiel. The two actually told the same story, but one tragically, Gerstein, the other like a funny story. Well, in any case, Gerstein saw it all and understood why the cyclone was needed, because to replace those diesel engines which didn't work. And on his way back to Berlin, in the train from Warsaw to Berlin, he recognized and met and talked to a Swedish diplomat, von Otter, and told him the whole story and asked him, prayed in a way. He was a very emotional man. He said, send a message to Stockholm, and they should then spread it to the Allies, to the Jews, send leaflets and so on. Well, von Otter sent a report, but the Swedish foreign ministry kept it until the end of the war, and they admitted after the end that they didn't want, they were very close to Germany economically, and they didn't dare to do something which the Germans could have discovered. And Gerstein then went to the Pope's legation, to the Nunciatur in Berlin, and was thrown out because he came in his SS uniform. Then he spoke to Protestant clergymen. And the answer was, look, even if I, the clergyman, would go up in church, in the temple, and say that the Nazis are criminals and here is what they are doing, the Gestapo would be there within an hour, and they would say that I went mad, and would take me away, and nothing would change, which is not true. But the fact is that this was what some of them used as a pretext. At the end of the war, Gerstein wrote 4 reports for the Americans, for the French, for the Germans in German, and gave them to the American forces. He went to join them. It was delivered by the Americans to the French, sent to a prison in Paris, we are speaking of 45, and as he was considered as a war criminal, because of delivering the cyclone all the time, he hung himself. So I call the book The Ambiguity of Good, as a kind of response to Hannah Arendt, The Banality of Evil. What to think of Gerstein? You needed to be probably extraordinarily heroic or a little bit mad to go and do something. But he did try. At the same time, he worked in the machinery. Anybody has a judgment? No.
As a historian, do you see history repeating itself today?
Why?
Ron?
No, I must admit I don't. But history can repeat itself. Rarely does it exactly repeat itself. But I don't see these events as were described in the context of what we call the Holocaust or similar exterminations. I don't see a repetition. The great question is, can you compare Stalinist, let's say, exterminations and Nazi exterminations, like in the book of Tim Snyder now? But that's another question.
I wasn't going to ask a question, but I was interested in response to the last question.
Yeah.
I want to see the repetition. To me, it is absolutely clear when you see the actions of Iran and the international community response. To me, it's an exact repetition of what happened.
Well, for the time being, what you are saying is once, well, we shouldn't enter into this endless debate. Once Iran has a nuclear weapon, it will destroy, it will obliterate Israel. No, that's not so fast. So, yeah.
Something I've wondered about. My father's now at Witzenberg, now surviving.
You still have?
Yes, he just recently passed away. Both of my parents were in the camps. One of the things that, so it's something I've thought about all my life. And one of the things I've never seen examined, but I'm no academic, maybe you could lead me to the right place or tell me why it hasn't, is the complicity, and I say more than just the complicity of the Christian church. And I know it's not a very popular subject for obvious reasons, but the complicity of the Christian church from the time of the 3rd and 4th century when anti-Semitism first started, through the ages, to make it a much more easy thing. My dad in Poland was Easter time, they would beat up the Jews for killing Christ.
In Poland?
Yes. And it was, it's always struck me that nobody will really look at the fact that that reinforced, or that gave some, what's the word I'm looking for? What? Not credence. It made it easy. It made it easy because the population of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, so much were taught from the time that they were young to hate the Jews for centuries. They were placed in ghettos. It went on and on during the Crusades. On the way to Jerusalem, they'd stop because I guess nothing was going on for the weekend and kill 4,000 or 5,000 Jews. And nobody has really examined that I've ever read, and I've never seen it either in an academic way or a philosophical way to show how that was an underpinning for the ability of Hitler to do what he did to the Jews.
Well, you are right about your vision of it, but thousands of books and articles. I myself wrote a book about Pius XII and the Third Reich in 1964. That makes me even older. And there I said that Pius, and you're right, the spreading of contempt.
Individual books have been written, but no academic, I think, has gone back through history.
Oh yes, there are many books about the whole story. And in France, immediately afterwards, Julie Zach wrote a book exactly in the line of what you are saying. But it is absolutely true there is no straight line from Christian anti-Semitism to Hitler's exterminations, but it created the ground which made opposition much more, in a way, psychologically difficult, because the Jews then, well, we don't like them. And that also religious in Poland, certainly, grounds in Ukraine and so on. So as these Jews, maybe they killed Christ or maybe not, but certainly they are not to be touched very much, why should we take the risk for ourselves or our families to go and help them, you see? So it created the atmosphere, and that is certainly true.
Excuse me.
You have this lady.
Dr. Ashvat does teach the beginnings from the early church.
Oh, she did, so thank God. I mean, now there is a proof.
Yes, I'd like to ask you, sir, what was the real underlying motive that Hitler had with this real, with the ideology?
Nobody knows the exact answer. He himself in Mein Kampf, his basic book, right, says that it's in Vienna during his years as a young man in Vienna. He spent, he tried his luck at the School of Architecture and he failed. And since knowing that story, I always say never fail a student. So he failed and lived painting a very ordinary kind of paintings of houses, of trees, and so on, and when selling them with a Jewish colleague. And he went, we know now that he accepted invitations to dinner in Jewish families who had bought his paintings. So there, it was not Vienna. It was sometime at the end of World War I, when he lived in Munich, and as you know, there was a Soviet revolution in Munich, and there were Jewish personalities, or personalities of Jewish background. They themselves considered themselves as communists, and that was that, who were very active among the leaders of the Munich. And Hitler then came to the conclusion that the Jews had created the stab in the back, had stabbed Germany in the back, were behind the revolutions, and were intent on destroying Germany. And then he started assembling all the anti-Semitic literature he could read, and was very influenced by a man called Dietrich Eckart, who was his mentor in a way. And Eckart had this from the 90s from the early 20th century. You know that the main book saying that the war between the Jews and the world was a war to death. And who is the person who put that in a book? Is an Englishman living in Germany, married to Wagner's daughter, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, in a book called Foundations of the 19th Century. Now, Houston Stewart Chamberlain lived very long and was still alive in the 20s. And Hitler came to visit him and shake his hand, and Chamberlain then said, "I have seen the man who will save us all from the Jews." So there are these deep roots. The first letter Hitler ever wrote on a political topic was about the Jews in September 1919 to a guy called somebody from Ulm, from the city of Ulm. The last sentence in his will, in his political will, continued the struggle against that world pest, world Jewry. So from the very moment he wrote something about politics to the very end of his life, that was his obsession. And obsessed people, how do you explain an obsession? But of course, the ground of anti-Semitism was so vast that Hitler could, of course, take from everywhere. That's in a way links up with what this gentleman said.
What was the influence of Germans outside Germany? The Sudetenland, one case, but also like in Lithuania, they had a tremendous influence from Russia.
I saw them in the Sudetenland. That makes me still older. That is, we lived in the Sudetenland part of the year. And the Henleinist, the followers of Henlein, who was the Nazi, in a way, representative in the Sudetenland before the annexation by the Germans of the Sudetenland in October 38, were very noisy and very present, and Jews started living for Prague and so on. They had no direct influence, but there were islands, like the German-American Bund here. For Nazi, there were opponents, of course, but for Nazi propaganda. That is, they were transmitters. And they created trouble in Czechoslovakia and other smaller countries. But here, for example, the Bund was very much influenced, let's say, by Nazi propaganda and radiated it, you understand, and then helped America first and so on. So direct influence, they were too small to have any influence. But as Nazi Germany was growing in strength and sending its delegates to those various places, it became other kind of sources of spreading influence.